Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar in the CERDP and ESTCP webinar series. My name is Jennifer Nyman. I'm a Principal Engineer at Geosyntec Consultants in Oakland, California, and the coordinator of the webinar series on behalf of CERDP and ESTCP. I will be facilitating today's call. The webinar will consist of a brief overview of CERDP and ESTCP, followed by a list of upcoming webinars in the series. After the opening remarks, we will transition to the technical portion of the webinar. Today's event features two speakers describing CERDP and ESTCP projects in the Resource Conservation and Resiliency Program area. Dr. Michelle Mack of Northern Arizona University will begin the presentation describing research to identify indicators of state change and forecast future vulnerabilities in the Alaskan Boreal forest. Her presentation will be followed by a brief question and answer session. Next, Mr. Kevin Biela of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory will describe results from subsurface geophysical mapping of permafrost to improve the resilience of infrastructure in cold regions. Mr. Biela's presentation will be followed by a second question and answer session. We will conclude the webinar with an interactive Q&A session with both speakers. Today's broadcast will be listen only. You may submit questions by using the chat box in the lower left-hand portion of your screen. You do not need to wait until the Q&A period to submit your questions. In fact, we encourage you to submit questions in advance of that session. On this slide, we have provided a few suggestions in the event that you experience difficulties with the broadcast audio. Typically, any delay will be fixed if you refresh your screen or call into the conference line. However, if you do continue to have problems, please submit a comment using the chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. CERDP is the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program established in 1991 by Congress as a partnership between the DoD, the Department of Energy, and the EPA. CERDP's mission is to identify and address high-priority environmental science and technology opportunities that focus on DoD requirements. CERDP funds both fundamental research as well as advanced technology development that ultimately impacts real-world environmental management. ESTCP is the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program, which demonstrates innovative environmental and energy technologies. These investments capitalize on past investments under CERDP or other research programs and are designed to transition technologies out of the lab and into the field. Especially important in all ESTCP demonstrations is the ultimate transition to implementation and regulatory acceptance. CERDP and ESTCP are complementary programs with much of CERDP research occurring at the lab and pilot scale with occasional field efforts, while ESTCP demonstrations are primarily at the pilot and field scale, although occasionally supporting lab efforts are conducted. There are 4 program areas in CERDP and 5 in ESTCP. The Energy and Water Program area is only in ESTCP, while the other 4 shown here are CERDP and ESTCP programs managed jointly by a designated program manager. Our webinar today is focusing on research and demonstrations that were conducted under the Resource Conservation and Resiliency Program area. Areas of investment include understanding DoD-relevant ecological systems, assessing the impact of military training on marine mammals, managing threatened, endangered, or at-risk species and invasive species, understanding watershed processes and management, developing the models and tools necessary to understand infrastructure vulnerabilities to and the impacts from climate change, and understanding the impacts to air quality from DoD activities. Our webinar series highlights research and demonstration efforts from each of the 5 program areas. As you can see, upcoming webinars will cover a broad range of topics, including the management of energetic and propellant material releases on testing and training ranges, zinc nickel dip and brush planing, research and development needs for management of DoD's PFAS-contaminated sites, building envelope technologies, and new research conservation insights to desert environments. And you can find more information about upcoming webinars at this link shown on this slide. Registration is now live for webinars through the end of the summer. I would like to remind you that a copy of the presentation of today's session can be downloaded from our webinar webpage. We would appreciate it if you could please take a moment to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen at the end of the webcast. And on slide 15, I am pleased to announce that for the first time since 2011, the CERDP ESTCP Symposium will be held next November in Washington, D.C. The 3-day event will showcase the latest technologies that enhance DoD's mission through improved environmental and energy performance. Registration information is available on the CERDP and ESTCP website. With that, it is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michelle Mack. Michelle is a professor in the Center for Ecosystem Science and Society and the Department of Biological Sciences at Northern Arizona University. She is an ecologist who studies the impacts of climate-sensitive disturbances, such as wildlife and abrupt permafrost thaw, on the dynamics of Arctic and Boreal ecosystems. Her work includes 2 decades of field research at the National Science Foundation-funded Boreal and Arctic long-term ecological research sites. She has over 150 peer-reviewed publications in high-profile journals such as Nature and Science. She graduated from the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, with a Bachelor of Science in Biology and a Bachelor of Arts in Literature. And she received a doctorate in integrative biology from the University of California at Berkeley. Michelle?
Hi. Well, thanks for calling into the webinar. I have control of the slides here. So our agenda for today, I'm going to talk briefly about the changes that we're seeing in Alaska's boreal forests. I'm going to talk about wildfire response to warming climate in these boreal forests, and then forest recovery and permafrost thaw following fire. And these are the things that we've focused on as some of the keys to managing military land use: vegetation recovery and permafrost thaw or recovery. I'm going to talk a little bit about the co-benefits of ecosystem state change, and then finally about forecasting fire management impacts on future landscapes. All right. Well, in the high northern latitudes of North America, climate is warming more than twice as fast as any other place on Earth. Where I work near Fairbanks, Alaska, the mean annual temperature has warmed by 3.4 degrees Fahrenheit over the last century, and winter temperatures have warmed by 6 degrees. There's ample evidence that ecological systems are responding to this warming. You're probably familiar with images of slow responses like trees migrating into short-statured Arctic tundra. But today I want to talk about really rapid changes that are occurring in the boreal landscapes. In these landscapes, the military manages almost 2 million acres of land. So understanding these rapid changes is really important for managing their future trajectories. So this is a zone of discontinuous permafrost, permanently frozen soils in cold pockets of the landscape, and you can see in the upper left-hand corner a picture of permafrost soils that have warmed, thawed, and collapsed, changing vegetation and hydrology. You can imagine how this would threaten infrastructure and training uses on military lands. Insect outbreaks, shown in the upper right-hand corner, are more frequent in warmer temperatures, causing reduced productivity and dieback of desirable species like aspen and white spruce. Human activities are increasing, the lower left-hand corner, fuel wood harvest and other types of management for fire prevention. And that brings us to wildfire. Fire has by far the largest footprint of any natural disturbance agent in the boreal forests. of the interior of Alaska. Fires are generally started by lightning, and they burn, in most cases, in wildlands. But there's evidence that with climate warming, this footprint of fire is growing on the landscape, and it's creating increased risks to infrastructure, risks to human health, and certainly creating new complexity for land and fire managers. Now, here I'm showing you a map of interior Alaska, and you can see the intermontane boreal ecoregion is defined by this strip of red fire scars. So this is all the area in interior Alaska that burned since 1950. And as I said earlier, the military manages about 1.7 million acres of land that's in the region around Fairbanks. And I'm showing in the inset fire scars on those military lands. So in addition to lightning, there are ignition sources that come from training activities. So the burning on military lands tends to be, well, there's certainly more fire starts than we see in the surrounding wildlands. So fire is a critical disturbance that's increasing in frequency, and it affects both emergency management decisions as well as longer use, like slower timescale management decisions like land use planning. So it's really important to understand how fire will continue to shape and reshape the landscape of interior Alaska. Okay, so as part of our modeling, we did some predictions of what future burning might look like in the interior. We know that as climate continues to warm, we expect that wildfires will increase. And in this figure, I'm showing you our modeling, which is using a model that comes from Scott Rupp's group at the University of Alaska, the alfresco model, to reproduce historic area burned in the interior and then to project future area burned. So that dotted line that you can see on the historic side of the time axis is the historic area burned. Now the red and blue lines are projections for the future, and they use two different climate models for these projections as well as a business as usual atmospheric change scenario. So that's atmospheric change based on our current commitment to emissions reductions. And you can see that towards the right side of the diagram that there are more and larger fires predicted for the future. So we're interested in understanding, well, what are the consequences of increasing wildfire disturbance for the state of boreal ecosystems in this region? What parts of the landscape will be resilient to increased disturbance from fire, so able to recover their intrinsic ecosystem properties after fire? And what parts of the landscape are going to be vulnerable to change to new states? And these new states might be for better or for worse. How can we predict when ecosystems will undergo change? Now, we think that the key to understanding this question resides with the soil organic layer. So boreal fires are carried by this thick accumulation of forest floor materials, mosses, litter, soil organic matter, roots, rhizomes, coarse woody debris. In black spruce forests, which are the most abundant vegetation type in this region, almost 90% of the emissions from fire come from the burning of this organic layer. And you can see these sort of wimpy black spruce trees here and see that they don't contribute very much. So, okay, so when we think about the characteristics of fire in these ecosystems, we usually start with thinking about fire severity, which is the proportional change in the ecosystem that's caused by burning. And this is largely related to the depth of burning or the proportional burning of the soil organic layer. In a low severity fire, just the surface of the mosses and the litter combusts. And in a high severity fire, we would see deep burning that would go into this like more decomposed soil organic layer. These soil organic layers can be between 15 and maybe even a meter deep in some of these upland ecosystems. So you can imagine a large range in the depth of burning. Now in both cases, in low and high severity fire, tree roots are burned and there's complete stand mortality. So we think of these as stand replacing fires. The soil organic layer modulates important ecosystem functions, It insulates permafrost from warm summer temperatures and from cold winter temperatures. It controls infiltration of water into the soil profile. It harbors plant propagules. It provides habitat for plants and animals. And then finally, it cycles carbon and nutrients, and it stores the largest proportion of carbon in these ecosystems. So these observations led us to the central hypothesis that it's really the severity of the burning of the soil organic layer that drives ecosystem state change after fire. And it's because of the importance of the soil organic layer's effects on permafrost, on vegetation, and carbon cycling. All right, so over the course of our project, we developed this conceptual model, and I've shown you sort of the linkages that we focused on the most in black arrows. So certainly climate affects fire, the frequency, the area burned, and the severity. And this fire characteristics are affecting the soil organic layer. That in turn affects permafrost and vegetation composition. And then finally, this can all be modulated by management that either works directly on fire or works on the fuels for fire, which then in turn has cascading effects on vegetation and permafrost. So these state changes in vegetation and permafrost really are of key interest to land managers. Vegetation determines fire behavior and spread, and also it determines the use that that landscape can undergo. The permafrost soils support infrastructure. You're going to hear more about that from Kevin. Roads, training areas, and it also affects access to wildlands, transport over permafrost. So I'm going to cover some ideas that we have and results about effects of changing fire regime on vegetation state, on permafrost state, and then finally understanding a bit more how management plays into these causal pathways. All right, so in interior Alaska, black spruce has dominated the forest for the past 5,000 years, and fire has been on the landscape about as long as black spruce. Historically, there's a fire return interval of approximately 100 years. And I've told you how fire combusts the soil organic layer, and then these are stand replacing fires. But historically, soils tended not to burn very deeply. They're moist and sometimes in even standing water. Now, black spruce has semi-serotinous cones, so seeds are banked in the canopy and they're released following fire. And these are relatively large seeds that sort of fall around the parent tree. So these seeds germinate on just about any type of seed bed, and then they reestablish that stand structure under the parent trees. This sets in place what we think of as a self-replacement successional trajectory, a resilient successional trajectory, where the soil and seed legacies of these past ecosystems are carried forward. But what happens to black spruce forests if severity increases? This is one of the key questions that we explored with this project. And we used a study design where we depended largely on some fires that burned in 2004, a record fire year. We set up a matrix of sites across the landscape in 2005 that included both the range of severity of burning and a range of landscape moisture classes. And then we've followed these sites over, well, now the last 15 years. So part of our SERDP project, we really focused on the decadal scale post-fire regeneration in these sites. And what we found was that sites that burned deeply lost that soil and seed legacy of the black spruce forest, and they transitioned to dominance by deciduous species. So in this figure, I'm showing you pre-fire and post-fire soil carbon stocks, so the amount of materials in those soil organic layers. And these are seedling recruitment trajectories 10 years after the original fire. And you can see the trajectories consist of stands that started as spruce that regenerated to spruce after fire, stands that started as spruce that regenerated to mixed, and then finally stands that started as spruce that regenerated to deciduous tree dominance. And you can see that black spruce stands that burned at low severity, so following that one-to-one line, returned to black spruce in the first decade after fire. The seeds were there, and the soil substrate was conducive to regeneration of black spruce and not conducive to regeneration of deciduous species. But at black spruce stands that burned at high severity, whether they're dry with thin soils on the left side of the x-axis or moist with thick soils, the right side of the axis, these severely burned sites became dominated by deciduous tree seedlings, primarily aspen and birch. Deciduous trees that have an almost continuous seed rain in space, so parent trees producing seeds that are coming in from off of the fire site. So this then has set up for us a model of understanding high severity fire regimes in this region. This high severity fire opens up a window for community reorganization and for change in successional trajectory and change in ecosystem state. High severity burning reduces on-site black spruce seed banks and exposes mineral soil seed beds. Wind-blown deciduous seeds, such as the aspen show here, recruit, and then they grow fast. If there's black spruce there, they outgrow black spruce. And we have evidence that supports the idea that these early stand dynamics, the first decade, really sets the stage for future succession. So things that start out dominated by deciduous trees are likely to persist over the next 100-year time scale as deciduous stands. Now, shifting black spruce forests to deciduous-dominated forests really changes functional aspects of these ecosystems. Now, as I've mentioned, black spruce are highly flammable. They're semi-serotinous. They grow slowly. Carbon accumulates in the soil and below ground. They're relatively low-quality wildlife habitat because of the forage they provide. And they actually insulate the soil over time, so permafrost recovers over secondary succession. And as a result of both permafrost and that thick understory layer of moss, they're sensitive to ground disturbance. Deciduous trees, by contrast, low flammability fuels, potentially a reduction in fire spread rate. Seeds come in from the outside. They grow fast. They accumulate carbon in stems rather than in the ground. They provide high-quality wildlife forage. And in some cases, when there is permafrost, they lead to the warming and thaw of permafrost soils, which then, over longer time scales, are relatively robust to ground disturbance. So you can imagine there are some desired properties of these deciduous stands that make them more amenable to particularly military training land uses, as well as things like low flammability that are desirable from the perspective of fire management. Okay, so just to show you some of our permafrost results, we find obviously that after fire, the range of soil temperatures increase and permafrost warm. And I'm showing you here some data from the Stewart Creek fire, which is on Fort Wainwright. And these are black spruce forests that are paired, burned and unburned. And you can just see that there's a much larger temperature signal over time in the burn sites and deeper into the soil profile than there is in the unburned area. And so a warmer, deeper soil profile in an upland site like this means more rapid nutrient cycling, a larger storage of water, more stand productivity. So potentially a higher productivity stand, and if there are more deciduous species, then those other aspects of ecosystem structure are also present. All right, and so we also did some modeling of permafrost dynamics to understand how those initial conditions set up by burning the soil organic layer might play out over time. So this is showing thaw depths, so the seasonally unthawed soil over a 100-year time series. And you can see that when in that top panel in upland sites, when the fire only consumes the top 12 centimeters, there's relatively little perturbation to the permafrost or the depth to permafrost. But as fire burns more of the soil organic layer, So approximately in an upland stand, 50% of the soil organic layer, and that's a not very severe burn in these cases. Then permafrost starts to recede from the upper layers of the ecosystem, and that active layer becomes substantially deeper. And when almost 3/4 of that soil organic layer burn, then we see a recession of permafrost from those upper 5 meters, and so effectively a relatively warm, high productivity ecosystem. Interestingly, the dynamics in lowlands were quite different, and these are probably low-density black spruce lowlands with really wet soils. And because of the thermal differences as well as the different position on the landscape, these soils are the permafrost in these soils is relatively robust to burning. There's only a small perturbation in the thaw depth, and that recovers over time. Okay, well, I want to shift gears now and move on to thinking about fire management, both through fire suppression and through reduction of fuels. These are both important strategies that can be implemented by land managers in this region. And we've been exploring questions about these strategies that arose from the fire management community. Okay, so first I'm going to talk a little bit about modeling impacts of fire management planning options, specifically on DoD lands. And so you can see where we are in Alaska, in that intermontane region. And then in the green is the Upper Tanana hydrologic basin. So this is sort of an ecoregion of interior Alaska that has a cohesive fire regime. And it also has the largest communities in Alaska that are on the road system, so the highest density of human infrastructure. The areas with crosshatching are military land, so it's about 16% of this region. And then you can see the fire management designations in sort of the order of intensity and cost: critical, full, modified, and limited. So most area burned in this region comes from natural ignitions in these limited fire management areas. But on military land, training activities also provide human ignitions. And so we know that there are more ignitions on military lands, and that the surrounding lands can be affected by fire activity on military lands, as well as vice versa. Wild lands can affect fires on military lands. Now, our conversations on this really came to a head in 2013, where an explosive ordnance on a military weapons range started the Stewart Creek fire, and this burned about 90,000 acres. It started in limited management and then moved into full and critical areas. And this led us to ask the question, what would happen if all military lands were designated full protection, so that when there are these additional fire ignitions, they would be put out rather than let to burn? And so again, we return to that alfresco model. This is work by Amy Breen and Scott Rupp at University of Alaska Fairbanks. And this model stimulates fire and vegetation succession dynamics at about a 1 kilometer spatial resolution. And they ran the model experiment with 2 climate models, like I showed you before, and then with 2 management options: the full designation and then the current primarily limited designation, to ask what would happen if military land fire protection increased. And, well, what they found was that there are huge differences in the climate scenarios driven by these structurally different climate models, but relatively subtle differences in fire management scenarios. So I'm showing you cumulative area burned over time here. And the 2 climate scenarios are the colors. There's sort of this warmer scenario in red and cooler in blue. And then the 2 management scenarios: continuous is the current management, and then the dotted line is the full protection on military lands. So in the warm climate scenario, well, you can see about 2 million more acres cumulatively burned by 2100. But the effect of full suppression caused a slight decrease in the area burned. And, what Amy's conclusions were from this research is that Well, you can see a big climate difference, so that shows some uncertainty in our future climate projections. But the effects of the change in protection level are consistent between the two climate models. So really the next step is to better understand the cost-benefit ratio for that subtle decrease in area burned associated with the new protection. So what are the consequences of these changes for ecosystem state? We looked again at that, how much deciduous forest, how much coniferous forest is on the landscape. And we found that, as you might expect across those two different climate scenarios, that as a result of reduced area burned, there are more old conifer stands on the landscape. So this is conifer stands aging rather than burning, and you can see this dotted line shows a slight increase in the conifer to deciduous ratios under both climate scenarios. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk a little bit about is fuel management treatments and how these affect vegetation and permafrost. And we also focused heavily on how these management treatments affect carbon stocks and nutrient cycling, but I won't talk about that today. So the two strategies that are being explored in interior Alaska consist of thinning, so hand removal to reduce the density of highly flammable black spruce. In this case, stems are removed off-site and they're burned in big piles. They could also be moved off-site for biofuels. And there's minimal damage to the soil organic layer beyond the compaction that comes from walking around and also removing trees. Shearblading on the right, by contrast, is a mechanical removal of stems with something like a masticating hydro axe, and then bulldozing the soil organic layer, all those ground fuels and the trees, into windrows on site and then burning them on site. And this causes, as you can imagine, a lot of reduction in that soil organic layer, and in many cases it exposes the mineral soil, particularly in these big areas where the windrows were burned. So we wanted to know how these treatments would affect forest recovery, so vegetation, the recruitment of spruce versus deciduous seedlings, and then also how these treatments would affect permafrost. And what we found, as you might predict at this point in my talk, is that that more severe disturbance of the soil organic layer really encouraged the regeneration of deciduous species. So this is seedling stems per meter squared across a suite of sites that are either unmanaged, thinned, or shear-bladed, and then I'm showing coniferous seedling recruitment in dark and deciduous seedling recruitment in light. And you can see that shear-blading reduced reduced coniferous seedling recruitment and really strongly increased deciduous seedling recruitment. So shear-blading treatments could actually shift these ecosystems to deciduous dominance, so less flammable, sort of a living fire break, as well as those other kind of desirable ecosystem co-benefits that I mentioned earlier. Well, what about permafrost? It's no surprise that shear-blading, which removes that insulating organic layer, increased permafrost thaw. And these are the differences that I'm showing you here, thaw depth differences between treatment and paired control plots, so locally paired plots for every single treatment. And for most of the thin sites, so for 70% of these sites, you can see that the confidence intervals are overlapping 0, and we can't really detect an effect, although there's some interesting variation in those thin sites that we've been exploring. But in the shear-bladed sites, 70% of the plots experienced relatively large increases in thaw depth. And these are the types of sites, they're mostly, relatively well-drained. And this is where loss of permafrost doesn't necessarily lead to surface collapse. So warmer soils, the potential for a more productive ecosystem arises as this thaw depth increases. Okay, well, just to reiterate some of the points that I've made to you today, we think that the footprint of wildfire is going to increase as climate continues to warm. It seems highly likely that the future of interior Alaska is a future where fire is even more dominant than it is now. I've shown you that the effects of burning deeper into the soil organic matter profile are likely to shift ecosystems from spruce dominance to deciduous trees and thaw permafrost soils. Now, alternative fire management, so managers fighting fires, and we explored changing DoD lands to full protection. This could slightly reduce area burned, but it would increase the abundance of conifers on the landscape. And by contrast, we showed that fuel management techniques can actually promote some of these desired ecosystem attributes, such as deciduous tree dominance, the living fire break, and the deepening and increased productivity of soils. As far as then the benefits for the Department of Defense that I see, well, climate warming is causing state changes in boreal forests, and it's not clear to me yet, although we're still working on these ideas, that full suppression will have very large effects. It seems more interesting to me, or more important, to focus on where the landscape is changing in response to these fires. And these changes to deciduous tree dominance have co-benefits: reduced flammability, resilience of that ground layer to training activities, provides higher quality wildlife habitat, and the potential for fuel wood harvest because of all that carbon storage above ground. Now, I've shown you that fuel management treatments can also attain some of these long-term co-benefits through shifts to deciduous tree dominance, primarily due to that shift in seedling regeneration. And burning and shearblading, both of these lead to degradation of permafrost soils, but in the case of these relatively well-drained upland soils, that might actually lead to higher productivity ecosystems. And there are some interesting results for lowland soils as well. Well, thank you very much for your attention. Oh, and briefly, I just want to acknowledge my collaborators in Alaska and at Northern Arizona University. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle, for a very fascinating presentation. And at this time, I would like to remind our audience to submit questions by using the chat box on the left-hand portion of the screen. We have already received a number of questions on this first presentation that Michelle will answer. The first question is from EPA. The question is, if the temperature is rising unusually fast around Fairbanks, is permafrost around Fairbanks melting?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think Kevin is really going to get into this question. But there is ample evidence that permafrost temperatures are warming. There's also evidence that in some areas land surfaces are undergoing subsidence. So the massive ice that's underlies the soil is melting, and then there's this collapse of soils into the volume that ice displaced. Yeah, so it's a very real issue, and any kind of disturbance to the soil organic layer, I've showed you shearblading and fire, but imagine road building, parking lots, any kind of disturbance in this climatic region where permafrost temperatures at the surface at least are closer to zero is likely to expose permafrost to a new temperature regime and to thaw. So this is a very real issue for both infrastructure and natural ecosystems in interior Alaska.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. The next question is from the Army Corps of Engineers. Did you observe any changes to the physical landscape associated with fires, such as erosion? And if so, could that have been a factor in which forest type dominated the recovery?
Oh, see, that's a very exciting question. So many of the sites we've been working on military lands are on relatively low relief surfaces, so they don't have a lot of steep slopes. But we've been working in Arctic tundra as part of some other projects on the North Slope, and their thermal erosion is a huge issue. So there was a massive wildfire in 2007, the Anatuvik River fire on the North Slope, and that burned through this continuous permafrost tundra region. And in the 10 years following that fire, we've seen a very large increase in the number of thermal erosional events, mass wasting of hill slopes, what things we call active layer detachment slides, retrogressive thaw slumps, erosional activities that just pump out sediment into either lakes or streams or rivers. And I think it's also really interesting to think about how this erosion affects, again, forest regeneration, because the tree species that recruit most rapidly on exposed mineral soil are the deciduous trees. And we see on the North Slope in tundra, it's deciduous shrubs that recruit most rapidly rather than the evergreen ericaceous species that dominate tundra. So I think that's a really important area for future exploration.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Texas Tech University. Is there a difference in O-layer bulk density between black spruce and deciduous forest?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So there's a paper in the journal Ecosystems by April Melvin, who is a postdoc on this project, and she compared soil characteristics in black spruce versus deciduous stands that originated in the same fire. And she found that, as you might expect, the bulk density is much higher in those deciduous forests, and the carbon concentration is somewhat higher, but the nitrogen concentration is a lot higher in those deciduous forests than in black spruce. But then the depth of the organic layer in deciduous forests is really shallow, and it turns over on, we think, a several-year basis, whereas in the black spruce forest, well, the soil organic layer accumulates throughout succession, so it doesn't even turn over in the mass balance sense. So big differences in bulk density and other soil characteristics.
Great, thank you. Another question. Would you please provide more information on what shearblading is?
Ooh, yeah. Okay, so my understanding is that it starts with a machine like a masticating hydroaxe that drives through the forest and clips off the stems of black spruce and then piles them up. And then usually a bulldozer goes in with a sort of the blade raised up, not not digging into the soil, but raised up, and then that pushes all of the trunks and a lot of that soil organic layer, at least the low bulk density surface of the soil organic layer, into a big pile. And they usually put these piles in windrows in these long linear lines, and then they burn them. And that burning is interesting from an ecosystem perspective, because often where those burn piles were, we get really, really deep burning of whatever residual organic soil there is, exposure of mineral soil, and rich, nutrient-rich pockets of ash. And it totally changes that surface pH of the soil, the hydrophobicity, and the nutrient load that's available for seedlings that are going to recruit in after that treatment.
Hi, this is Jennifer. Thank you so much, Michelle. That's all the time that we have now for questions, but we'll have Michelle come back at the end of the webinar to answer some additional questions. So if you have more questions for Michelle, just note that in the chat box and she'll be coming back. The next part of our webinar will be presented by Mr. Kevin Biela. He is a research civil engineer working with, with the Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Fairbanks, Alaska. He is the technical point of contact for the laboratory's Permafrost tunnel in Fox, Alaska, and is the project engineer for the Permafrost Tunnel Expansion Project. His areas of research focus on improving methods for permafrost geotechnical investigations and the interplay between degrading permafrost and built infrastructure. He is a practicing professional engineer in the state of Alaska and has authored numerous peer-reviewed articles and engineering guidance documents. He earned a bachelor's degree in geological engineering from the University of Alaska Fairbanks and a master's degree in Arctic engineering from the University of Alaska Anchorage. Kevin?
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you everybody for attending this seminar. And I'd like to especially thank Michelle for her presentation. That was very interesting. The forest ecosystem is so important, especially in interior Alaska. So my presentation is we have been working on a CERTA project to evaluate better methods for the Department of Defense to build on permafrost terrain in a warming climate. And so our project was aimed at looking at drilling and geophysical methods in particular. So during this talk, I'll specifically talk about the DoD's role in the Arctic, what permafrost is, its thawing issues related to engineering, current geotechnical characterization, and how we're looking at improving it with geophysical investigations. What are the benefits of this higher ground resolution when you use geophysics, and refined designs that should be a benefit of this higher ground resolution for building more robustly in a warming climate.
And Kevin, I'm sorry to interrupt. It's a little bit hard for the audience to hear you. Can you speak more loudly?
I'm talking right into my phone. Should I go to speaker?
That sounds much better right there. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was on handset. Is that much better? I'm now on handset.
Yes,
okay.
That sounds good. Thanks.
I'm sorry about that. The U.S. DoD operates many installations in Arctic and subarctic regions. And these regions consist of permafrost, which are very icy terrains. But that icy content is very heterogeneous. In order to investigate that for engineering purposes, most consultants and government officials use borehole drilling, which is kind of the gold standard for geotechnical investigations everywhere, not just in high latitudes. But we are showing that geophysics can better delineate in between the boreholes and basically connect the dots by giving the kind of qualitative amounts of ground ice and show the extents, the boundaries, and the anomalous areas. We believe the ground ice detail will reduce over-engineering, which is a bit prevalent right now. Engineering is very conservative to accommodate all the ranges of the heterogeneity, and we believe that this will reduce costs and logistics in the longer term. These refined designs, we hope, will spawn novel architecture that can offset climate impacts, and we're hoping that this novel infrastructure will be more efficient for DoD and anybody else concerned with developing in northern regions. So the Department of Defense has numerous installations in the Arctic and subarctic. The image on the left is a depiction of the circumpolar north with continuous, discontinuous, and sporadic permafrost. Continuous is generally everywhere. It's very thick in sequence, 1,000 to 1,200 feet thick, and generally is everywhere regardless of aspect and water content and so forth. But when you get into the discontinuous region, which is like the interior of Alaska, it's thinned quite a bit. Its temperature is warmed up to near freezing, and it's breaking up into areas where it exists and it doesn't exist. sporadic is an area that would be characterized in Alaska of kind of down in the Anchorage area. But so DoD has installations. You can see my red stars are the major installations. 3 which exist in interior Alaska, 1 down in Anchorage. It's a joint base between the Army and the Air Force. And then we have a major installation in Greenland, Thule Air Force Base. The pink asterisks indicate lesser installations, but nevertheless they're still very incredibly important for surveillance and tracking. These are radar installations that the U.S. operates in conjunction with the Canadians, the long-range radar system, and this is formerly known as the DEW line. So there's significant amounts of infrastructure in the Arctic that the DoD needs to be concerned about. And there's possibly just development in general might be increasing in the Arctic, and so that's what we're looking at primarily. As Michelle noted, the temperatures are rising, especially it's a higher magnitude in northern regions, northern latitudes, and so the air temperature is rising, and the ground temperature is keeping lockstep with that. The permafrost temperature, it lags, but it's keeping lockstep with it. Vladimir Romanovsky up at UAF has been tracking this with a series of boreholes extending from the North Slope downward through Alaska, and it's pretty clear that the temperatures are rising. So permafrost, just by definition, is any earth material that's frozen for 2 or more years, and that doesn't speak to the material type or the ice content. However, material type and ice content are, from an engineering perspective, are very important. So that's what we're aimed at this project, is to better characterize those 2 properties. In the image in the upper left, we see work that Krell has conducted on Fort Wainwright for the last 15 years, mapping an area that is important for groundwater movement. And you can see that the discontinuous nature is just as it speaks, very discontinuous, blobs of permafrost. And this is dependent on, there may have been fire in the past, as Michelle pointed out. This could be human disturbance, or just sediment deposition, or flooding from the Tanana, Chena rivers. Off on the lower image, what we see is a continuous region. This is polygonal ground. What's below all those green lines that you see are ice wedges. Ice wedges are pure ice that are meters in width, meters in depth, and tens of meters in length. So in that image, you can see that that's a significant amount of ground ice. The picture in the upper right is ice wedges in a road cut around Fairbanks. The dark areas that you see, those are actually the ice wedges. And so it's a significant amount of ice in the subsurface. And as you can see, very heterogeneous. If you drill at one location, you may hit soil. If you drill at another location, you may hit ice. So when this ice degrades, the problem is displacement. That ice takes up a volume, and when that ice melts or thaws, that volume is filled by adjoining soil, and so you get displacement at the surface. And you can see I've got various photos illustrating the effects of the damage. The core on the left, or the photo on the left, is an ice core from our permafrost tunnel that it's about 2 inches in diameter, 4 inches in height. And upon thawing, you can see that about 50% of that is water. That's actually sometimes a minimum with silty environments. Yedema environments, we've seen it up 70, almost 80% by volume. So significant amount of water. Shear strength is very low. So infrastructure has a problem bearing on this type of material. So with DoD, this is a particularly acute a problem, and the most illustrative examples are at Thule Air Base. The photo on the left, we can see ground ice that's entrained in the weathered bedrock, not far below the surface, and you can see the thaw settlement that's occurred there. They used to paint the runway white. They painted the runway white for about 60 years, and that was to increase the albedo and lower the summer thaw depth, which actually worked pretty effectively, but it was very expensive. There was a safety hazard for aircraft. You can see the white painted airfield down in the lower right. That's about 4 million square feet of pavement, extremely costly. The upper right photo is a hangar, very large scale hangar that's useless now for aircraft because the middle of the hangar has a nice basin in it, over 3 feet deep. It still can be used for storage, but not for its intended purpose of aircraft maintenance. But we can deal with this. We learned a long time ago how to deal with frozen ground, and there are various methods. The upper left photo is what we call a heat pipe or a thermosiphon. This is a flight tracking facility in Fairbanks, and these heat pipes extend underneath the foundation and keep it permanently frozen. The picture on the right is very typical Arctic construction that we see all across the circumpolar north and in Antarctica, where we raise the buildings off of the ground and get a free air space underneath, and that keeps the ground refrigerated. It thermally decouples the building from the ground. And then the picture on the bottom is a hangar at Thule, where they experimented with air cooling foundations, passive air cooling foundations. These are a bit problematic, at least in this design, where humans have to go around and open up these louvers and close them, so that's a twice yearly operation. Snow can get into these, debris can get into these, and dirt, and so they have to be flushed and steamed periodically in order to keep them maintained. These methods are expensive, however, and they raise the conservative design for the buildings, for the military construction, and our goal is to try to eliminate and work away from these types of methods. So typical geotechnical investigations is borehole drilling. Here we're doing some direct push methods, but nevertheless there are different types of drilling. You can see on the right, here's our goal, is to find the bad actor, which in this case is ice, and we found it in this case. This is a nice Holocene ice wedge. But we want to be able to see what's in between these point locations that we've done with drilling. And so for this project, what we did is we used electrical resistivity, two methods, capacitively coupled resistivity and electrical resistivity tomography. The CCR is a fairly shallow method, but it's continuous. It can be pulled along by a snow machine, ATV, or human power. And the ERT is much shorter in length, hundreds of meters as opposed to kilometers for the CCR. But it can go much deeper, and its resolution is a little bit better. It's time-consuming to put the stakes into the ground and hook the cables up. So there's trade-offs with each, but they both work comparatively, or they correlate very well with each other. So our testing, we utilized a site owned by the University of Alaska Fairbanks, over by the university, and we conducted about 9 transects and did a bunch of passes over each to test the methods. In this picture, the blue are the transects. We used available trails. We really didn't cut anything to do these techniques. The yellow dotted line and the orange dotted lines are slough deposits that run through this from what's called Dead Man's Slough, which runs off of the Chena River. These are Holocene in age, buried slough deposits that have high ice content, organics, peats, but there's a bit of surface expression with a little bit of a transition to mixed and even more deciduous vegetation. And so our Transect 3, which is shown in the upper left, that's where we did our intensive drilling for this property. We drilled every 3 meters in spacing and for over 100 meters, and then sampled every 30 centimeters on each hole. The holes range from about 7 to 8 meters in depth, getting down into a very substantial gravel layer down below. To compare our drilling versus at least the CCR, this upper image shows our mapping results of that intensive drilling campaign. The vertical lines are the boreholes themselves. The blue, the more purple, is actually pure ice. Those are Holocene ice wedges that you see. The blue is very high ice content silts and peats. And then that grades to kind of a light blue and an even lighter blue, which is very low gravimetric moisture ice contents. The pink are thawed, and so we see this work was done in the summer, so we see about a 3-foot active layer across the surface. And on the left-hand side, there's a water feature, and it's a little bit cleared in that area, so we actually have a much degraded permafrost terrain there, which with the deep thaw depth. So our CCR image across this is depicted below, and the way that we like to represent the resistivity is with the high resistivity is represented by reds and oranges, grading down to greens and blues for very low resistivity. And high ice content, ice is very resistive to electrical current, so that ice is the high resistivity. The blue and the green is low resistivity or even thawed. The water is very conductive, so that works on that end of the scale. As you can see, the high ice content areas, we mapped it with the ice wedges and the very icy peats. That shows up to be very high resistivity, and that maps very well qualitatively. The thawed area on the left, that maps very well with our low resistivity values on the left-hand side of the pseudo section. And on the right-hand side, we have kind of a comparative color as the thawed area with the very with a blue and kind of a green. But that's a frozen area, but that's very low ice content. So those areas would need drilling to determine exactly what's happening there. But the important thing is that we see very distinct boundaries that correlate very well with the drilling. So that was qualitatively, but we wanted to do a little bit of a quantitative assessment. And so we took the sediment particle size definition, the Unified Soil Classification System, and binned all the samples that we took and with their moisture contents, and we compared them log of resistivity against the logistics water content. And what we see, we base this off of what we saw on the pseudo sections, and compared that to exactly what we saw in the pseudo section at each borehole. And what we see is a nice relationship for each sediment class. The gravels are not quite as consistent as the sands. The poorly graded sands, the well-graded sands are very consistent. When we get up into the peats and the silts, we get some more scatter. But we feel like we were able to quantitatively show that the resistivity matches borehole drilling very well. So in this image, I'm comparing ERT versus the CCR. And so in our lower image here, we have CCR over the entire transect, not just the area where we drilled. And I've shaded out everything but that in the upper image. So we can compare just looking through my crosshatched areas to that sliver, the crosshatch areas of the CCR to that sliver across the top of the ERT. You can see pretty good correlation. Now again, these are a little bit different methods. One is directly coupled, the other is capacitively coupled, so there's a little bit of difference electrically. But nevertheless, we still can see the very definitive boundaries. A high conductive region right here in the ERT correlates well with this high conductive region here in the CCR, and then of course the high resistivity region correlates very well. And then just in looking at our at where our transect is located, I bounded that out with these black dashed lines, and you can see that our thawed area on the left right here shows up very well, and the ERT as well on this side, and then our low resistivity area on the right-hand side, but what we know is still frozen, is very well represented. So the two methods work very well together. It's just depending on your application. And here's some work that we did for a linear construction. This is a new road that's planned, a new alignment for the Dalton Highway north of Fairbanks. And it was drilled every 300 feet, and we conducted CCR over the entire length of this new alignment, which is about 8 miles. And the high resistivity section is shown in red. Again, that's our same color coding, with the green and the blues being the low resistivity, low ice content, or even thawed. It might be a little hard for the audience to see this, but each borehole is represented completely on this plan and profile. But the important thing for you to see is the black line that's associated with each borehole on the left-hand side of each log. That indicates frozen ground. That's so that an engineer, geologist can quickly look through the boreholes and see which are frozen or not. And so in the red region, what we see is that every borehole is frozen. It has the black going down the left-hand side. But when we move into the left-hand side here, where we have these greens and blues, we see that these two boreholes actually are thawed, and this one is thawed near the surface, but down at depth, it's actually starting to be frozen again, and that correlates very nicely with the yellows and that are starting to show up in the pseudo section. And the same thing is being indicated on the right-hand side, where we have this far right borehole that is showing thawed ground. Now the benefit here is that what we identified by doing the CCR first, we actually use the geophysics to guide the drilling program. That would be the biggest benefit here, is we can eliminate boreholes. We can either eliminate those and reduce the budget and the effort to the borehole campaign, or transfer that effort over to more critical areas like bridge abutments, water crossings, that kind of thing. So just in that red region, we estimated that we could remove at least half of those boreholes, if not more, and that's a huge time-saving, cost-saving measure. And another part of this project was to determine if we can provide some drilling guidance for frozen ground. And here I give a sampling of a little bit of the work that we did for two of the soil classes. The one on the left is a poorly graded sand, and the one on the right is silt. And what we're illustrating here is that we varied the sampling depth with 30, 60, and 120 centimeters. And then we also varied the borehole spacing. So first we did every borehole at 3 meters, then we removed a borehole in between, so every 6 meters, then 12 meters, then 24. And those are the various lines that you see, and then that's plotted against gravimetric moisture content. And for the poorly graded sand, you can see that our level of confidence, no matter how much we decrease the sampling frequency, it stays fairly high. Everything's fairly consistent within a few percentage points gravimetrically. However, for the silt, there's quite a difference. Our level of confidence drops quite a bit. As we increase our borehole spacing, our moisture content, gravimetric moisture content, averages drop dramatically, and this is over 30%. So we're able to provide some very specific drilling guidance and tell engineers exactly how much effort they should put in for accuracy. So what we're really driving at with this project is to be able to very quickly determine where are the best locations for infrastructure. In this image, we want to place two buildings on this site. Again, we have some thought. We have some very low moisture, very low ice content, permafrost, and some very high ice content. The two red areas indicate very high ice content. And so on the left, we absolutely need to put that structure there so we can put a slab on grade. We feel comfortable with that. Maybe we do this with resistivity, and then we borehole test it, borehole calibrate it, and we can put a slab-on-grade structure at that location. But over on the right, we absolutely have to put a structure there. So we know that we've got great ice contents, and we need to elevate and keep that building keep that foundation frozen. So that's kind of the crux of this project here, is to quickly delineate where to place structures. And with that, we were able to test some structures, test some novel foundations. And this is an example here where we did a slab on grade. This would only be applicable for ice moderate to ice poor terrains. This still probably would not be applicable for an ice-rich terrain like a Yedema, an ice complex, a silty ice complex. But nevertheless, this is about a foot thick sprayed foam foundation with a 4-inch pipe interweaved throughout. And it just in itself, it did a good job of resisting the building heat, decoupling, partially decoupling the building from the ground surface. But in the wintertime, we put a fan on the pipe and blew ambient air through. And you can see in that graph above how it reduced the temperature at the slab interface by about 6 degrees Fahrenheit for the 3 months that we tested it. So this is the kind of thing that we're striving for, is that if engineers understand where their low ice content specifically and how much they span, then they can actually come up with these novel types of designs. And here's another one. This, again, this would be more applicable for an ice moderate to ice poor terrain, but this is a full basement foundation. This actually exists at the Cold Climate Housing Research Center. And it's a full basement heated building directly coupled to the ground surface. And it's ice moderate terrain, so they built this spread footer foundation with a grade beam. And the idea is that if they do get thaw settlement, they've already built into the system areas where they can put in floor jacks and they can lift the building back into place. And then they would spray in structural foam and fill that void, and then they can work with the minor thaw settlement that they would get. This is a kind of novel architecture that we would like to see begin to be used in a warming climate. We believe that this will have great benefit. The very conservative engineering that's occurring today is extremely costly, and we can go to methods like this that will still provide very aesthetically pleasing and nice and warm buildings in very cold environments, but they don't need to be so conservatively constructed. Here's a building that we worked on at Thule Air Base, and the benefits of the geophysics here is that only 1 or 2 boreholes actually identified a very icy trough that existed right through the middle of the proposed construction for this 40,000 square foot vehicle maintenance facility. And so we did geophysics to actually map out perfectly where the ice content was, and this allowed the engineers, the overall project managers, to evaluate whether it was feasible to just dig out the ice. And because of the location with a nearby river and lots of fill material available, it was deemed that it was actually more economical to just dig out that ice, even though it was at a fairly deep depth of about 10 meters, to get rid of that ice and then build just as traditionally as we would in the lower 48 of the United States. So this building was not built with a frozen ground foundation. It's slab on grade, which is ideal for a vehicle maintenance facility. And the ice is gone, and this property will be prepared for climate change. It's a climate neutral situation for perpetuity. So in conclusion, our current methods for geotechnical evaluation drilling, it provides very low ground ice resolution in most all permafrost terrains. It doesn't matter. But what we show is that electrical resistivity methods provide a very efficient method to connect the dots and increase that resolution. The electrical resistivity maps very well to the moisture content of the terrains. We've shown that. And what we believe is that the increased ground ice resolution should provide novel engineering, provide people with lower risk and the confidence to be able to start to apply novel engineering to some of these, to unconventional solutions for high latitude construction. It allows the engineers to think outside normal constraints. and that's tough for engineers. We're bounded by what's constantly being done, and so we don't like to jump out of the box too much. Things are very over-constructed because of that, and with a projected climate warming, it's tough to pull away from those conservative designs. But this is going to be especially important as we suspect that there'll be further development in the north. That might mean a further DoD presence in the Arctic and subarctic areas, and we need to have efficiencies with construction. These high latitude areas are very remote, and they're possibly going to be long-term operators, and so we need to provide the tools to most efficiently build in these areas. And I believe that's it. You can go on the website and look more at my project. It's RC 2436 under the Resource Conservation Area. And there's my contact information if you'd like to contact me directly. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. Excellent presentation. We have received several questions from the audience, and I would like to remind our audience at this time to submit more questions for Kevin in the chat box. First question for you, Kevin, is from EPA. Does the movement of groundwater through discontinuous permafrost cause permafrost to melt more quickly?
Yes, absolutely. And that's actually a very intriguing area of study. Michelle talked about it a little bit, with fire frequency and exposing permafrost terrain, basically de-armoring the permafrost terrain. What we're seeing, we have these active layer detachments, retrogressive thaw slumps, but there's a lot of these very, very localized, what we're calling blowouts. We're starting to see these in the upland terrains where the groundwater, surface water, which normally ran through the vegetative layer, through the mosses and the very near surface vegetative layer, is now able to dive downward through the poorly bonded Holocene sediments and quickly erode and take out cavernous areas, tens of meters in length, tens of meters wide, and tens of meters deep, and displace a lot of sediment material. And so water is, what we're hypothesizing is that water is now starting to be a very major player in sculpting these warm permafrost environments, especially in the upland gradients. So I think that's a very exciting place for research, and yes, absolutely.
Thank you. The next question is from the Army Corps. Does drilling initiate or increase permafrost melting?
Well, generally drilling is done after you've done some type of disturbance. It's very difficult to get into an area and not initiate some type of vegetation disturbance. And in these warm permafrost environment like interior Alaska, it is so ecosystem protected by the vegetation that you do a little bit of disturbance and you're going to initiate thaw. So I guess in the long run, yes, drilling does cause permafrost degradation. The drilling in and of itself does not, but getting the cleared area and getting to be able to get the rig in absolutely does initiate some disturbance, yes.
Okay. And the next question is also from the Army Corps. How does electrical resistivity compare in cost, time, and accuracy to other geophysical methods like GPR for permafrost detection?
Yeah, that's a really good question. A lot of people are probably more familiar with GPR, and so that when we get questions on geophysics, that's kind of the term that gets dropped. They have different applications. GPR is really good for linear structures, so sedimentary structures, linear investigations into linear man-made structures like roadways, dikes, dams, that kind of thing. What radar can pick up very readily is the interfaces between, say, frozen and thawed, wet versus dry, ice versus no ice. That's where radar works really well. It doesn't work very well on vertical ice features like ice wedges. A lot of people have just really wanted GPR to work in that realm, but it doesn't work, in my opinion, very well in that way. But the dielectric contrast between, say, ice and water, you can very easily pick up the top of permafrost. That all being said, radar is not very useful in silty environments. The clay mineral composition of silts in high latitude locations just saps the energy out of the radar signal, and you get very poor returns. It doesn't matter whether it's thawed or frozen. So you have to be careful with your GPR usage. But what we do is we couple GPR with electrical resistivity almost 100% of the time. And putting the two together are very indicative tools when worked in comparison. And then when you throw aerial photography or aerial imagery on top of those two, the picture of your subsurface is quite incredible. And that's really what the crux of this project was to show that you can use these standoff techniques to a great benefit, and borehole drilling is really just kind of your last result. Drill a couple holes and confirm, and then move on with your design. So yes, geophysics is very useful. GPR, some of the other methods like conductivity and so forth aren't so useful, but GPR and resistivity are very good.
Thank you, Kevin. And we have one more question for you before bringing Michelle back. It's an interesting question from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Are the techniques that you discussed today being considered for addition to local and state building codes in Alaska?
I don't think that. I think it would be a stretch for regulators to absolutely require that these things be utilized. But what we're trying to do is encourage and show consultants that these are very useful techniques. And then what we're hoping is that just by the market value, this will start to increase. You know, this used to be very black box technology that a lot of people didn't really understand. And so what we're hoping through our work is that we're going to show people that it is very easy to interpret, and that it's not that difficult to collect. It doesn't require a PhD to collect some of this information. And I think that's how we're going to get this into the realm. I think the market value, the market's going to drive this, as it's shown that the economies by doing this can reduce borehole drilling and the time that it takes to do borehole drilling. I think the market value will take over instead of having to regulate it.
Okay, thank you very much, Kevin. And now we'll bring back Michelle for a few more questions. There's one question specifically for Michelle, and it's from the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation. Michelle, what metric was used to determine deciduous forests are higher quality habitat than black spruce forest?
So that's not a trait that we actually measured directly in this project. It's based on observations of sites undergoing that deciduous trajectory have usually a higher abundance of willows and of, mainly willows. And then also the observation that some of these deciduous species are higher quality forage than spruce.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. The next question will be both for Michelle and Kevin. Kevin, we'll start with you. What are the next steps for each of the research areas that you described today?
Well, with the increased ground ice content, we'd like to now expand that to the benefits so our testing really was done in discontinuous terrains. What we'd like to do is continue our drilling frequency methodology for continuous terrains and see how that differs between the two. Because the sediment types, the glaciofluvial sediments of high latitude terrains are quite different than what we see, like say in interior Alaska, and so that's our next step. Really getting these types of systems to be more, these geophysical systems to be more readily usable in these difficult terrains like the forest areas. without having to do clear cutting is probably the next step in this, and that'll take some leaps in technology, but that's where we'd like to get to. Ultimately, we would love to be able to do very quick assessment via either airborne methods or satellite imagery. That would be ultimately the best way to go. I doubt we'll ever get to satellite, but we certainly could move this to the airborne realm.
Thank you, Kevin. And Michelle, what do you see as the next steps for the research that you described?
Well, I think we're sort of focused moving forward on 3 different areas, the vegetation, the permafrost, and then the fire management. And we're continuing to follow that suite of 2004 fires to see if in the second decade those patterns that were set in the first decade persist. And also in that second decade, we can look at change over time in both vegetation and permafrost in relation to that initial burning. For permafrost, we've been monitoring ground temperatures in different types of burned and unburned sites. And a next step there is further exploring those temperature dynamics and then using them or comparing them to some of the modeling that our group has been doing. And then finally, with the fire management, we want to continue to follow some of these fire management treatments. Most of them were initiated between 2005 and 2012. And so we have one time point of vegetation and permafrost, but we would like to have a second time point to look at trajectories of change over time following fuel management. And also, I know that Amy Green and Scott Rupp are interested in continuing the dialogue about how changing fire management affects fire behavior and fire spread on the landscape, and what the cost-benefits ratios are for those changes.
Thank you. And we have just 2 minutes left. So the final question to each of you is, what is the one main takeaway message that you would like to leave our audience with today? And we will start with you, Michelle.
Oh, goodness. Well, I think that the idea that boreal forests are in a state of change, and we know that's true for all ecosystems on Earth. They're at some point in their recovery from disturbance. But the fact that the frequency of fire disturbance in particular is changing here, I think means that we're going to see really dynamic patterns on the landscape over the next 100 years. And, you know, I think a really important thing to think about, which combines Kevin's talk and my talk, is that these changing disturbance regimes are interacting really strongly with permafrost ground. And I think what better way to accelerate the loss of permafrost in the high northern latitudes than burn off all the insulating cover, particularly in areas where permafrost is ecosystem protected. So that's my take on the 2 main messages.
Thank you, Michelle. Kevin?
Well, I would definitely, it'll go back to my presentation where we really believe that we can do a paradigm shift with architecture and design if engineers are provided a high resolution picture of the ground surface, or the subsurface ice content. We really think that some novel techniques will be provided that will break away from the traditional. These are very expensive solutions that are costing everybody a lot of money. Everything that's built within the government is taxpayer money, and so our ultimate goal is to reduce those costs to the taxpayer and build more robust infrastructure for a warming climate. Everybody's very concerned about if I expend this amount of money now and I have a 50-year life term on my dormitory or my vehicle maintenance facility, is climate warming gonna have an adverse effect? So how much money do I have to put into that to armor it up for that 50 years? And we believe that our techniques will allow engineers to very specifically and reduce their risk and know that they're doing the right thing by moving into a low ice area and knowing that that area is low ice and that they can build appropriately for it. So that's one takeaway. The other takeaway, I will couple that with Michelle, is the water is going to be a big actor here, especially in these discontinuous permafrost terrains. And as the ground temperature keeps warming and the ice content, the ice strength decreases, and we get more precipitation, we're going to start seeing more of this. And so we need to be pushing on the research that's going to allow for effective installation placement to ensure that they don't get impacted by these areas that are going to be rapidly thawing, and that we know how to deal with these. Water movement and silt deposition is going to be a tough thing to deal with, and it's going to be expensive. So that would be my two takeaways.
Okay. Thank you again very much, Michelle and Kevin, for the excellent presentations and for answering the questions today from the audience. Our next webinar for CERDIP and ESTCP will be on Thursday, July 27th, and it will be on the management of energetic and propellant material releases on testing and training ranges. It will feature two speakers. Registration is open for the webinar, so please visit the webinar webpage to register for this and other future webinars. And I would like to remind you that both the audio and a copy of the presentation of today's session will be archived on our webinar webpage in case you would like to refer to them in the future. We would appreciate it if you could please take a moment to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen at this time. And this concludes today's webcast. Thank you.